In this lecture, we'll look at the development of education ideas and thoughts in the Revolutionary period. And I mean 1760 to about 1830, this early years of the early Republic, and some of the ideas that were floating around. The questions we'll be addressing in this session: how did the Enlightenment influence the ideas of public education? What influence did the Revolution have? And what did the founding generation think about public education? One thing to remember is a lot of events happen. And if you're a student of history, some of these are going to be very familiar to you. The French and Indian War and its effect and how it led up to the Revolution. Other ideas, like the development of the Sunday School or Webster's American Spelling Book, may not be as familiar with you because these are historical events tied to education. But one thing to remember is that what goes on in the public schools is kind of a microcosm of society as a whole. And I think in the following lectures you'll see that things that happen outside affect the public schools. Things that happen in the world at large affect the public schools. Things that happen in the nation affect the public schools, and are often what goes on in the schools is a reflection of that, just like today. So I think that's what the textbook is going to be showing you, and that's what I hope to show you in these lectures. So if you want to look over these, you're more than welcome to. We'll cover some of these in the lectures as well. When we look at the Enlightenment, what does that mean? Well, we talk about the Enlightenment, we talk about this idea that reason was important, that the age of reason is the title sometimes given to the Enlightenment. And several things contributed to the Enlightenment. First of all, you have the Protestant challenge to the Catholic Church, the Protestant Reformation, or the Protestant Revolution, as it's sometimes called. This idea that the Catholic Church, which had been around for over 1,000 years, was no longer the only idea of how people should practice their faith. They could still be Christian, but they took many things away from the church. They stripped the new church of many Catholic ideas. So there's that as one issue. A scientific revolution was also taking place. People like Copernicus, who said, look, the universe doesn't revolve around the earth, but the sun is the center of our solar system, and the earth revolves around it with the other planets. That was revolutionary, heretical, according to the church, and Copernicus paid for that. Galileo also made this challenge later on, and he was also punished for this. Then in the 1400s, you have the development of the printing press, so that printing became much cheaper. Now, by our standards, it would still be considered expensive, but it was much cheaper than the old-fashioned ways of just copying manuscripts. And it made printing easier and more affordable and put more printing in the hands of more people. So all of these affected change that came to be known as the Enlightenment, that ideas could be spread much more quickly, that these changes, these challenges to established tradition and established beliefs could be spread. And we have some people that are important in this Enlightenment period. Descartes, Newton, Voltaire, Francis Bacon, John Locke, all of these idea makers, their ideas were now much more readily available to a wider audience. And so how does this affect American education? Because a lot of this happened centuries before the United States was founded, and certainly before the British and the Spanish had colonies here. So the Enlightenment influenced what was going on in the Americas, what was happening in the New World, in a variety of ways. So in this colonial period, and I'm talking from about 1500 to 1700, you do see the development that people are beginning to see history as the unfolding of progress, that people were perfectible and we were getting better and better as time went on, and that education was very important because it helped us become better. It defeated ignorance, and it also helped promote justice by considering that injustice, tyranny, was caused by the ignorance of the people, was a major key to education being considered very important. Because, again, we go back to that human reason was paramount to Enlightenment thinkers. So people had to be able to reason, and in order to be reasonable, they had to be informed. And so that's where education comes in. This idea of Republican virtue, and Republican, I don't mean a political party, I mean the idea that human beings contribute to their government. They form a republic. And so this idea of Republican motherhood, that women were instrumental in training up future citizens. And so women had to be carriers of virtue, they had to be carriers of education, they had to do a lot of things to help promote the people that they were raising, their children. And this is a quote I'm going to use several times throughout this semester. Jefferson's, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be." This idea that you have to be educated in order to be a good citizen. And you also see this later on in Jefferson's Bill for the More General Diffusion of Knowledge, where Jefferson said, look, we don't have a hereditary monarchy anymore. We are a nation, and we'll look at this in future lectures. We are going to be a nation where you don't have specific classes that are going to rise to the top, that theoretically anybody can be anything, right? And so you needed a publicly funded educational system, and that's what we mean by public education. You needed this so that the cream could rise to the surface, right? You could find those gems amidst the rocks. And so what he is suggesting is a structured, scaffolded form of education. Public education for a few years, the best and the brightest rise to the top. They are then educated more, and then at the end, you have the best of those people will be able to go to college for free. And so after this educational process is finished, you'll have the best of the best, and these people are going to lead the new nation. So Jefferson is often kind of seen as a key figure in the United States' Enlightenment influence. And so he has quotes that are often pulled out. Here's a brief idea of what he was saying. Wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. That whenever things get so far wrong as to attract their notice, they may be relied upon to set them to rights. So that education, through education, people would be better citizens. People would know the difference between good government and bad. And so this is one of Jefferson's ideas. And Jefferson was a big proponent of public education. Another proponent during this founding period is Dr. Benjamin Rush. Now, Rush is brought to the educational forefront because he participates in an essay writing contest by the American Philosophical Society on proposing a new national plan for education. And he was a scientist by profession, a doctor by profession. And this contest that he won, very similar to Jefferson's. Jefferson's idea for school that we just talked about in our last slide over the staggered schooling for the state of Virginia, Rush says we should do this nationally, a very similar plan nationally, and that the federal government should have an idea, it should have a role in public schooling. Now, how effective were the proponents of public education? Well, so, this essay contest, as your book points out, gets a lot of attention and a lot, kind of seen as the canon of the Founding Fathers' beliefs on education. But if you look at the background, there were only 7 entries in this contest, and only 3 were considered as being serious entries. And Rush was on the board of the American Philosophical Society. So, there's some questions about its effectiveness and how broad these ideas were. But what they did do, and the essayists did do, is they identified for us today what the major lines of thought were on public schooling and on education in general in the Founding Fathers' generation, in the early days of the United States. How many public schools were actually formed? Very few, if any. How widespread was support for public education? Well, at least among the already educated, it was seen as a good thing. But most of the people who were educated were from the upper class anyway, because they were the ones who could afford schooling for their children. And you also do have some people in the merchant class, business class, and others who are coming up and trying to educate their children at least basics. Now, that doesn't mean that the poor were uneducated, and they had some basic literacy and some basic mathematical skills, but for the most part, we might consider them educated at a very, very basic level. One of the other founding fathers of education was a man named Noah Webster. And the dictionary is named after him. So Webster's dictionary, in fact, his book, The Dictionary of the American Language, in 1825, kind of gives us an idea of what Webster was going for. Now, you can see that he was very influential in education, but one of the things Webster did, this was kind of a nationalistic approach. He wanted an American language. So the British people spoke differently. They pronounced things differently. He wanted Americans to develop their own version of English. So spellings were changed in many cases between British and English spelling, British and American spellings. Also, words took on slightly different meanings. And today, if you were to watch a BBC or British television news, you would see some of these that still, these changes and these differences between American English and British English still persist today. And Webster was the one who said we need to develop our own language. So he wanted a United States first, as it were, version of the American language. And that's what he was promoting in his dictionary. So if we wrap things up and look at how the Enlightenment influenced these ideas of schooling in the United States. So these are the questions I had at the beginning. I would say that education was seen as being important in developing humanity. And humanism, was one of the guiding principles of the Enlightenment. And so education was key in perfecting the human being, in perfecting reason, and perfecting human thoughts and abilities and actions. What effect did the revolution have on public education? Well, without a nobility, many of the early founding generations saw that education for everybody, a common education, was very important. Again, as Jefferson and others believed, and he wasn't the only one, right? George Washington, some of the other founding generation, said, look, without this idea of a ruling class, because one of the things we did was we got rid of titles of nobility when we set up our own government, is how are we going to find good qualified leaders? Previously, with Europe, you had titles of nobility, and that's where the leadership came from. The problem was it wasn't always good, right? There were people who had issues, people who weren't interested. They were realizing that the nobility didn't really mean anything except that you just had more money. And so educating common people was important because that's how you were going to find and train up A, good citizens, B, informed citizens, and C, the new rulers of the nation and of the state and local government. So what did they think about public education? By this I mean educating everybody. They believed it was important but expensive. And so, I kind of say here they believe it was important but not enough to fund it. They did think it was important, and they did see a day when public education would be important. They just, at the time, there was a lot of conflicting issues, a lot of conflicting ideas. Not everybody agreed. Not everybody wanted to spend money. And so in the early days of public education, one of the things they have to do is convince the general public that this is a necessity and something that should be done. And I think this is important because I think sometimes today when people look back on education, they said, oh, the federal government isn't involved, it's a state and local issue. But if you look at the Founding Fathers, they certainly believed that the federal government and that the nation should have an interest in public education. Thank you for joining me. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the development of the common school.